in this country. The Constitution doesn't talk about slavery. The word is not mentioned anywhere in the document. So let me say that different. The document does not mention the word slavery, but it is talked about throughout the document. It is not, the word is not mentioned in the Constitution, but slavery is talked about, or things around the issue of slavery in this country all throughout the document. One of the things that is in there is that the traffic in slaves, or the traffic in persons, doesn't use the word slaves, would no longer be legal after 1808. But it is documented that there were more ships docking on the coast after that. And so we'll get into that a little bit later. But because of these underground movements, and movements even earlier than that to avoid the taxes on slaves, we'll never truly know how many, but there are conservative numbers that they document. Some of it is documented through information that we know, because there were cargo that was moved, that people knew about, that was moved within the concept of it. And they were documenting the number of persons that were on those ships. And so using those documents and then estimates of others that we don't know, there is a conservative number of between 10 to 12 million slaves that were moved off of the continent. I will tell you that about a little more than 500,000 of those landed in what we know to be America today. So out of that 10 to 12 million, the overwhelming majority of them went into Central and South America. I have an image that I can put up on the screen, but I don't think you can see it. So I won't move slides up here today. But I do want to show you this, because I'm going to talk about what the triangular trade was, but then also what the Middle Passage was as well. And we'll spend a lot of time on the Middle Passage. But before we get there, I want to make just a quick transition from Africa to the transatlantic slave trade. There's something that I'm looking for here. You just give me just a second. Here it is. I'd mentioned in the previous weeks about the history of Africa. And I made the point that Africans were not waiting on Europeans in order for history to start. Africans were making their own history. And so I want to talk a little bit about the economic life in Africa. And so a couple of things I'm going to read, and then I'll make some points out of what I read. But I want to make this point. In John Hope Franklin's book, From Slavery to Freedom, it says, it would be erroneous to assume that Africans were either primarily nomadic or simply agricultural. There exists in Africa such a diversity of physical environments that it would be impossible for people to evolve identical ways of life in different parts of the continent. It is an incredibly diverse continent, largest and richest in the world, incredibly diverse, not a country, but a continent made up of multiple countries. Now today 50, but that would not have been how the continent was divided at the time that we're talking. And so I encourage us to go into this trying to pull off of as much of what we know about, or what we think we know about the continent even now. And what we see relative to the continent today is not how it was arranged then. And so as an incredibly diverse continent, essentially agricultural, The people of Africa displayed a remarkable degree of specialization within this ancient economic pursuit. The African concept of land ownership stemmed from the importance of agriculture in the people's way of life. The land was considered so important to the entire community that it belonged not to individuals, but to the collective community, which was comprised of first occupants of the soil. One of the most important local dignitaries was the master of the ground, who was at the same time the grand priest of the local religion and the administrator of the soil. And so want to highlight some of the things about the diversity of the land and how all of us would have, our lifestyles would have revolved around the part of the continent we would have been on, because the land gets a vote. And so there's not this one concept of Africa where all African people would have been the same. But within that concept, they were incredible agriculturalists. Whether land was held individually or collectively, and it seems that both practices were in use, the tillers of the soil devoted all of their energies to the cultivation of their crops. Soil was cleared by felling trees and burning the underbrush. The ashes were used to fertilize the ground, which was in turn prepared for planting with the use of large spades and short handles. Seeds or sprouts were planted in mounds or embankments that had been carefully prepared. Frequent weeding was necessary, especially in new ground, in order to prevent the young plants from being choked. Millet, wheat, rice, cassava, cotton, fruits, and vegetables were commonly grown. Dotting the countryside were towers from which watchmen drove away birds and grain-eating animals. Harvest time was a particularly busy period during which grain was reaped, threshed, milled, and stored, while other fruits and grains were made into fermented drinks, and cotton was manufactured into thread and cloth. Man, all of that on the continent of Africa. Many would have had us to believe from the things that we saw on television growing up that there was not this level of specialization that was going on the continent of Africa, but it absolutely was. Domestic animals were part of almost every farm, but in some areas, the rural people devoted most of their attention to the grazing of sheep and cattle and the raising of chickens and other fowl. In northeastern Africa, some tribes were known for their great skill in breeding and care of cattle. In the East, many villages ascribed so much importance to the raising of cattle that wealth was measured in terms of heads of cattle. The Bantu and Khoikhoi engaged in farming as well as large-scale cattle raising. Artisanry was a significant area of economic activity. Artisans, individuals who were skilled, even among the so-called backwards tribes, there were those who were skilled along various lines. Among many people, there was a remarkable knowledge of basketry, textile weaving, pottery, woodwork, and metallurgy. The Pygmies manufactured bark cloth and fiber baskets. The Khoikhoi devoted much time and attention to making clothing from textiles, skins, and furs. The Ashantis of the Gold Coast wove rugs and carpets and turned and glazed pottery with considerable skill. In many parts of the Sudan, there was extensive manufacturing of woodenware, tools, and implements. The use of iron was developed very early in the economy of Africa. There were iron workers and individuals who were skilled in iron from Ethiopia all the way to the Atlantic. There was much evidence of their abilities in the manufacturing and use of iron. Many careful students of primitive civilizations credit indigenous Africans with the discovery of iron. That it was indigenous Africans that actually discovered iron. And as an anthropologist named Franz Boas insisted that Africans were using iron when European people were still in the Stone Age. the simple process that Africans were found to have used and the early date at which they began to make iron suggests that the natives of Africa and not the Hittites were the ones who first discovered its use. Africa exported iron for many years, and blacksmiths and iron workers were found in many parts of the continent. With simple bellows of the charcoal fire, the native blacksmiths smelted his ore and forged implements such as knives and saws and axes. Africans also worked in silver and gold and copper and bronze. In Benin, bronze and copper implements and art objects testified to the great skill of these smiths, while many artisans, including those of the Yoruba lands and Mali, we talked about before, devoted their attention to the making of ornamental objects from silver and gold. There's so much more I could go into, but I wanted to bring that up because, again, as we begin to transition to this slave trade that would bring African people from the continent of Africa to what is now the Americas. They didn't bring a primitive people. They didn't bring across those waters an uneducated population. They did not bring a people who they had to bring over to the continent and teach and train. They didn't bring an illiterate people. They brought a people who were skilled in many, many things. Many of this, as I mentioned before, as they were trading in other parts of the world, because there were very metropolitan people who were traveling all over the known world in ships, as well as with others. There were people who knew of the skills that were resident on the continent of Africa. And so I wanted to paint a picture that I believe is different than most of the pictures that we've seen or that we've been taught. But again, I don't even want to say we're scratching the surface. We're just picking at the surface because there's so much history there. History that you should be proud of. History that's not talked about. History that's out there that many people know, but are not teaching in our schools. That because if we knew, we'd know the incredible background that we possess as a people. And so they didn't bring an unskilled, illiterate people that were on the continent of Africa backwards, not able to interact, but they were doing incredible things on the continent of Africa before we arrived on this continent. I'm about to get into a part of this study that's probably going to be difficult for some. So allow me to preface what will come in the next couple of weeks with this, and I'll mention this as we each week as I go into this, because the Middle Passage is not an easy period to teach. It's just not. It is a horrible time for the people who are forced into this life. As I talk about it, as I talk about some of the things that come out of it, and some really gut-wrenching things that I believe that hearing them for the first time for some may be hard to digest. But I ask you to hang in there. Why? And here's one of the reasons why. If our ancestors could endure it, the least we could do is learn about it. If our ancestors could endure this period, in honor of them, we should know what they fought through. As I said before, you're only here today. All of us, we're only here today because our ancestors chose to fight. And we are products of those who kept the fight. And we're products of those who refused to die. And so I challenge us to go into this part of the history with our eyes wide open and honor the fight, and the struggle. I don't want you to leave here only focusing on what happened to our ancestors. What I challenge us all to do is to focus on the fight that they fought in this process, because they didn't see it as the end. They fought through because I believe they believed that there was better on the other side, and they believed it for us. And so I opened this with a quote from a slave ship captain in 1701 that says, "We stood in arms, firing on the revolted slaves, of whom we killed some and wounded many. And many of the most mutinous leapt overboard and drowned themselves in the ocean with much resolution." With much resolution. That this slave captain in 1701 is talking about a slave revolt on the ship that he was the captain of in 1701. That lets us know that our ancestors did not simply go on these ships and resign themselves to their fate. But when opportunities presented themselves to fight, they chose to fight. And I would argue that that fight is still in us, to continue to do what we need to do, much like our ancestors did, because I believe they fought for us. They fought for future generations, that they fought because they didn't just simply accept their fate. Because I would argue that though the enslavers were attempting to do one thing, but the individuals on these ships did not see themselves as slaves. That because they didn't see themselves resigned to their condition, they fought. And you'll see many discussions or writings about things like this as slave or ship captains would document many revolts that took place on ships along these voyages. The book that I'm reading now, Vincent Harding, There Is a River, in its chapter From the Shores of Africa, this is what he says. "It began at the edge of our homeland, where the verdant forest and tropical bush gave way gradually to the sandy stretches of the Guinea coast. It began at the mouths of the rivers, from that northern point where the Senegal and the Gambia pour their troubled streams into the waters around Cape Verde, down the thousands of miles of coastline to the place where the mighty river Congo breaks out into the ocean. On these shores, near the mouths of these rivers, we first saw the ships. There was no way to know it then, but their crews of men and boys came from many ports and many paths to find the shores of Africa. They sailed from Amsterdam and Lisbon, from the Nantes and La Rochelle, from Bristol and London, from Newport and Boston on ships with strange names. They came to us on ships named Brotherhood and John the Baptist, on Justice and Integrity, on Gift of God and Liberty. They came on the good ship Jesus. But by the time our weary lines of chained and mourning travelers saw the vessels riding on the coastal waves, there could be but one name, one meaning: captivity. Thus it was on the edges of our continent, where some of us gulped down handfuls of sand in a last effort to hold the reality of the land that the long struggle for Black freedom began. There were those who would grab a handful of sand and swallow it as a last-ditch effort to hold a part of home with them as they were forced onto these ships. And so as a result of it, it says struggle was inevitable for the captives, and preparations began early. There were many times when the forced marches from the interior or the long rides in the river canoes brought our people to the terrible rendezvous with slavery long before the ship Morning Star and Mary had arrived to receive them. Often, even when the ships were anchored in the bay, the involuntary Black pilgrims were kept waiting weeks at a time until a slaver's full human cargo had been collected, then guarded by other Africans who had made a tragic choice. Huddled together in rows of wooden shacks known as barracoons and factories, forced into dungeon-like castles and forts, which the Europeans had built on the coast or simply settled in open clearings by the riverside, a troubled and bewildered people had time to consider the past and the future, time to ponder this new captivity, which dominated the present time, time to grapple with the need to break free. And so I started today by talking about the incredible diversity across the continent of Africa and all of these people with their different religions and languages and cultures that are now huddled into these ships, huddled even before the ships into these barracoons and into these dungeons. They would find themselves with all of their differences now coming into this place that gives them a common reality. I need you to push that back out. I want to show that screen. It's okay because I'm about to talk about it. But it huddled them into this challenging reality that gives them a commonality, that with all of their diversity, they now have this common experience. And I would argue that it's here in these barracoons, in these dungeons, in the halls of these ships, where in some instances, hundreds of them would be shoveled in to these ships and placed side by side with another board over the top of them and more put in, and another board on top of them with more put in. And they would be sailing across the Atlantic. And many of these trips early took over 3 months time. And they'd be taken out in groups and allowed to walk on up at the top of the ship and then put back into their spaces to continue the journey. Many of them sick, many of them dying. But it's in those places of all of these varying cultures and varying languages and varying religions and varying experiences that this common challenge is where there's a process. I'll use the term African, but I'll use it loosely. That they begin to become what we know today as African American. That from all of this diversity and all of this culture, all of the knowledge and understanding that they had, that out of this common challenge, this common enemy, this common experience, they begin to become a people from a diverse group to a group that now see their fates intertwined and their struggle connected. And so I want to talk a little bit about this image that you see above my head, that on the Atlantic Ocean, there was a 3-part trade. And the trade from Africa to the Americas was called the Middle Passage because it was the second leg in a 3-leg journey for the ships that were traveling. They would leave America with raw materials going up to Britain, where they would drop off that raw material and get paid for the raw material that they had transported from America to Europe. They would take other things that they would trade into Africa for slaves. They would trade guns and weapons, and they trade textiles and other things that they would bring down on those ships for what was then the first leg. They would leave Europe going to Africa on the first leg of that journey, taking the things that they would trade with the Africans for the persons that they would get in exchange. They would put them in those ships, and as I said in some of the reading earlier, they would bring those ships and they would leave those slaves, those Africans who had been brought in from the interior of the continent. Initially, as I said before, that some of the earliest slaves were simply captured from the continent. They were not any type of an organized slave trade, but they were simply kidnapped off of the continent, placed on ships, and sent up to Europe early. The Spaniards were big with that. But it's the Portuguese and the Spaniards who are early the largest transporters of slaves. And then Britain would get into this business and become even bigger than those two. But this traffic, this Middle Passage, and I talked about it last, although it is second, because it is through that traffic they would then offload those Africans and then fill up those ships with the raw material that is being collected in those original colonies on the coast of what is now the New World, and then shipped over to Britain, who owned those colonies. But those ships were coming from all over Europe. And I've mentioned the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And these are some of the things that the author talks about. Because as I said earlier, when you look at who they're pulling off of the continent, they're pulling skilled laborers. They're pulling, as I hear people say that, you know, we were all kings and queens coming off of the continent. And I tell them that's not true. Everybody wasn't a king. Everybody was not a queen. They did pull royalty off of the continent, but everybody wasn't royalty. We couldn't all be kings. Somebody had to be the subjects of the king. But what you had on the continent, though, were people who, much like you look at organized countries today, these were organized countries with all levels of skilled people and educated people that were then being pulled off of the continent. And if you need workers, what are you going to pull? You're going to pull those who are the strongest in order to do that work. They pulled out of the continent incredible people with incredible skills and incredible knowledge. That's what they were pulling out of the continent and bringing them to what is now, we know now as the New World. So allow me to read this poem by Robert Hayden. It says, Middle Passage, voyage through death to life upon these shores. Blacks rebellious, crew uneasy. Our linguist says their moaning is a prayer for death, ours and their own. Some try to starve themselves. lost 3 this morning, leaped with crazy laughter to the waiting sharks, sang as they went under. Voyage through death. Voyage whose chantings are unloved. A charnel stench, the sluvium of living death spreads outward from the hold, where the living and the dead, the horribly dying, life interlocked, lie foul with blood and excrement. Deep in the festering hold, thy father lies. The corpse of mercy rots with him. Rats eat love's rotten, gelid eyes. But oh, the living look at you with human eyes, whose suffering accuses you, whose hatred reaches through the swill of dark to strike you like a leper's claw. I bring these up because I think it bears importance to let us know that our ancestors did not simply accept their fate, but from the very beginning chose to fight. There are those who have argued, and I'll say the name, Kanye West, who made a statement that with slavery lasting for as long as it did, that it was a choice that we were choosing to accept our fate. But I would beg to differ, and I would argue from the documents that Kanye is wrong, that our ancestors never simply accepted their fate, that but from the very beginning, they chose to fight. And while they did not have, they were not in the strongest of positions, I would argue, if I was to call it a poker game. Now, I've never played poker. I know a little bit about the game, but I know that when you play poker, everybody at the table gets cards. Some people have better cards than others. But I would argue that if we look at what's going on now, and when we talk about slavery, and we look at the period, that if it was a poker game, that we had cards too. We didn't have the best cards, but much like poker, because nobody knows your cards, there are things you can always do. I've heard of this thing they call bluffing. And that because you don't know what card I have, you don't know what card I'm going to play. And our ancestors always understood that while they may not have had the best cards, they still had cards. And so there are times when you look at the Middle Passage, this incredibly horrible period, where some of them played the hardest card, where there was some, much like this writer, Robert Hayden, said, they would leap overboard. Vincent Harding talks about people writing on these voyages that they became so common, and things that transpired on these ships happened so often that sharks would begin to follow slave ships because they knew that at some point on the journey, food would fall overboard. That food would have been some of our ancestors who either were thrown overboard because they were sick, and the captains of the ship were trying to not allow their sickness to infect others, because ultimately the number of persons that made the trip across the Atlantic dictated how much money they would make. And so they would toss sick persons overboard. There were some of our ancestors that when they attempted to take over ships and those attempts didn't go well, in a last-ditch effort would jump overboard. There were those who would fall overboard with their children because they did not want their children to endure what they now knew they were facing on the other side of the Atlantic. That it happened so often that sharks would begin to follow ships because they knew that at some point they would eat. For those who died and were tossed overboard because they were dead, there were those who fought and chose to jump. There were those who fought and were pushed. But it happened on every voyage that sharks would follow ships. But you are a product of those who didn't jump. You were a product of those who fought. You were a product of those who chose to fight and to endure, because I believe they knew that there was a time that would be better than the time that they were experiencing then. John Blassingame, in his book, The Slave Community, talks about the chains of American Negro captivity were forged in Africa. Prince and peasant, because everybody wasn't a king. Merchant and agriculturalist. Warrior and priest. Africans were drawn into the vortex of the Atlantic slave trade and funneled into the sugar fields, the swampy rice lands, or the cotton and tobacco plantations of the New World. The process of enslavement was almost unbelievably painful and bewildering for the Africans. Completely cut off from their native land, they were frightened by the artifacts of the white man's civilization and terrified by his cruelty, until they learned that they were only expected to work for him as they had been accustomed to doing, watch this, in their native lands. See, some would have you to think that they came without knowledge, but many of them were brought to certain parts of the country because of the skills that they possessed in the country that they came from. That many of the folk who came to South Carolina to grow rice, they went to South Carolina to grow rice because they grew rice at home. And many of the folk who enslaved them didn't know how to grow rice, but they pulled them out of the places where they were because of the skill sets they brought with them. That the thing that we have to tap into is an understanding of what you brought and who you are, that comes out of what came over those waters with our ancestors. They brought an incredible amount of skills, and they were afraid until they understood what was going on. Still, some were so morose that they committed suicide. Others refused to learn the customs of whites and held on to the memory of African cultural determinants of their own status. To argue, as some scholars have, that the first slaves suffered greatly from the enslavement process because it contradicted their heroic warrior tradition, or that it was easy for them because Africans were by nature docile and submissive, is to substitute mythology for history. The enslavement of Africans was intimately related to the history of Indian-white relations in the New World and certain historical and anthropological principles. In regard to the latter, historically, it has been almost impossible to enslave members of societies who are nomadic food gatherers, herdsmen, hunters, or fishermen. Consequently, Europeans in North America either exterminated the warlike hunting tribes or worked the simple food gatherers to death. Talking about what was going on here before we got here. Neither group made effective slaves. And on the other hand, and in spite of the myths surrounding the noble red man, when Europeans encountered Indians of a higher culture, accustomed to systematic agricultural labor and sedentary habits, as did the Spaniards in Mexico and other parts of South America, the Indians were reduced to slavery or something closely associated with it. In Africa, whites encountered some of the same problems they did with Native Americans. Like many Indians, African hunting, pastoral, and fishing peoples were too nomadic or warlike to be captured. As a result, most of the Africans brought to North America were members of agrarian politics in West Africa, accustomed to hard, continuous labor and a sedentary life. A majority of them belonged to the Igbo, the Iwe, the Afara, the Congo, the Wolof, the Bambara, the Ibibio, the Serer, the Arada peoples, members of the large, well-organized African states like the Yoruba, the Dahomey, the Ashanti, the Fulani, the Kam, the Mandingo, and Hausa, with their centralized governments, fast-moving cavalries, or disciplined standing armies, rarely fell into the slave traders' hands. It took the British, even with modern weapons, until the first decades of the 20th century to conquer some of these states. That they've been trying to conquer some of those for over 100 years. It took them well into the 20th century, rather, until they were able to do it. On occasion, some of the centralized states became so weak that large numbers of their citizens were captured, as happened with the Oyo Yoruba after 1750. For the most part, however, these people were almost immune to enslavement. In fact, these were the nations which made war on their more peaceful or defenseless neighbors and sold them and the peoples who fell under their political, economic, military, and cultural hegemony into bondage. Approximately 10 to 12 million were brought to the New World between the 16th and the mid-19th century. And you think about those numbers of people who are depopulating this area of the world and what it means for the continent left behind. Because a lot of times we'll talk about what happens here. I think what we forget is what happens there. When all of these individuals, with all of the skills and all of the things that they brought with them that are no longer in their homeland, what is it doing? And when it's coming to weakening the people who are there? Because it's later, because initially when European people come to the continent, the African people do not allow them into the interior of Africa, but it is only after the weakening of those people and some very long strategic things that Europeans did do they get entree into the interior of Africa. It took a long time before they would get access to be able to go into the interior. It's one of the things, if I could talk about a couple lessons, a couple things that I will say, is that we have to understand that if we're going to move in the direction that we truly need to move collectively, that we have to learn how to operate in what I call long-term strategies. What you've heard me say, not yet in this class, but those of you who have heard me over time, to use the term intergenerational strategies. We have to build strategies that will outlive us. That as we're growing and as our children are coming up, we're teaching them what's next in the strategy. Because as Dr. King would say years later, that he might not get there with us, but we as a people will get to the promised land. What he's saying is that we're building a strategy that I will probably not live long enough to see come to fruition, but it's going to come, but it only comes if the rest of us continue to work the strategy. What do you mean? One of the things that Europeans did on the coast is that they would have children with African women because the Africans would not allow Europeans to go into the interior of Africa. Think about this. They had a long-term plan that their children, because they come from African mothers, would have access to the interior. Think about how long of a strategy that had to take. And they were willing to wait it out in order to get what they were trying to get. That in order for us to understand that we've got to learn, and we have it, we've had it, we've always had it. We've got to get some of that back. We've got to get out of this mindset that if I can't see it in my lifetime, I'm not willing to work for it. We've got to recognize that we've got to be willing to work for the things that we may not see, because that's what our ancestors were doing when they were fighting on those ships. That's what they were doing when they were fighting on those plantations. I'm going to do a whole series as we go through this on slave revolts that took place in the Americas. Some of them here, I'll talk about some others, very strategic ones that happened in other parts of the Americas that had effect here as well, because I want to drive this point that I've been making all night, that our ancestors did not simply accept their fate, but they fought from the very beginning. And that fight still resides in you today. There's a quote, as I was going through, I want to see if I can find it. If I don't find it, I'll make the point and then I'll bring the point back next week. Because I would argue, I'm going to bring up some, as I'm talking about this, I believe history should always inform the present. It has to. Because if it doesn't, I would argue, then it's useless. If all we're doing is learning about these things just so we can become smarter in them, and we're not pulling the lessons from them in order to learn and to be better going forward, because I believe all of our history informs our present and helps us move forward if we learn the lessons from them. Those who don't know their history, it is said, are doomed to repeat it. The challenge with it, though, if you don't know it, you don't know you're repeating it. Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And if we're learning the lessons, then we don't have to make the same mistakes. And so when we look at this, there's a whole conversation today. It's been a conversation for as long as slavery has ended, this whole thing we call reparations. I'm going to bring a point. I'll bring it back to next week. I'll probably start with it and then go back into some more about the transatlantic slave trade before we transition into slavery in this part of the world. But I would argue that the country should absolutely pay reparations. I would say it for a couple of reasons. One, because other cultures who've been done wrong have been paid them. Even cultures that have been done wrong here have been paid reparations. I would also show you that this country has made other countries pay reparations to other folk that they've done wrong too. Germany would be one of them at the end of World War I, where they worked it into the plan at the end of the war. They all blamed Germany for what took place, and they made them pay it back to those countries that were affected. And so when we think about the other piece of this is I'll argue it this way. And I'm going to show you the quote. Is I got about 4 books up here. I gotta go back and mark it and make sure I have it marked properly for next week. But I would argue it for this reason. That the very economy of what is now America was built on this practice. And it was built through unpaid labor. It was built through these incredible atrocities that were taking place from the continent of Africa across the Atlantic and then on this land. And I remember raising this question a few years back. Some of you may remember, like me, that there was a time when folk who were voluntarily smoking and getting cancer from tobacco, despite the fact that the Surgeon General's warning was on the side of every cigarette box that said smoking is hazardous to your health. And if you're pregnant and you're smoking, it would be hazardous to your child. And people still did it, although there were some addiction things that were in there as well. But people were making these decisions, and they were suing tobacco companies and were winning lawsuits. States were suing tobacco companies, and they were paying because of the cost of tobacco in hospitals and medical cases and people's lives. And so if people were voluntarily using this product and suing tobacco companies and winning cases in the millions of dollars, why then are people who were forced to work on those same tobacco plantations involuntarily not due compensation for what was done to them? When people voluntarily made decisions and were compensated because of what that tobacco did to them, though folk were involuntarily forced to be on those same tobacco plantations, yet the arguments being made that there's no, that reparations should not be given. They should absolutely be given. And we think about it from the standpoint of the sheer amount of money that was being made through this practice. I believe it is absolutely owed. And we should never stop demanding it. I remember years ago, the argument was made. It said, should we do it? I said, yeah, we should. So you may not ever get it, but it does not mean you should not always demand it. And I would argue that we should always demand it. And I believe that if we approach it from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness, then we'll force the country to eventually do it. And I challenge us as I prepare to close today, as it's now 8 o'clock. And as we will pick back up on this and to talk a little bit more in detail on some things on next week as we make the transition into the practice of slavery. But I want to end it how I started it. And I want us to look at it as we're going through these periods. The first thing I said earlier, if our ancestors could endure it, then at least we could do for them is to learn what they endured and to honor them and to honor their fight, because I believe they were fighting for us. They were fighting for generations yet unborn. And we are those generations that are now born. And we should know what we were born out of. But I don't want us to learn this and go away from this simply talking about what people did to us. I'd rather you not really talk about that much at all. But what I would rather us do is to garner a sense of pride and to garner a sense of who we truly are by tapping into and learning about the fight that has always been in you, by learning about the amazing things that we brought with us. And there are many of those things that are still here today. And we'll talk about those in one of our lessons as well. I will call them Africanisms, that I will talk about some of them later on. But I challenge us to approach this class each week with a desire to learn as much as we can so that we can honor our ancestors and honor the fight that was in them and to honor what they did for us. Because I truly believe they were fighting for each and every one of us, fighting for you and fighting for me. And so you see this image behind me of this incredible, brutal journey of African people across the Atlantic that in some cases early on took longer than 3 months journey. As technology and shipping improved, those journey times would decrease over the years, but the process would become no less inhumane. But you are a product of those who continue to fight. And so honor their fight by continuing that fight.